By now, unless you have been living under a rock, you've heard this buzzword, UBI, or Universal Basic Income. Conceptually, the quickest loose definition of a UBI is a certain quantity of money given by a government to its citizens incrementally on a yearly basis, and hopefully enough to keep things stable in conjunction with an existing income. I think we can all grasp the purpose of it, but many don't believe it should ever be inflicted upon society, and many contend with the reasoning as to why it's become necessary to even talk about, and of course the labelling and supposed stigma of it all. Many people can only see the pre-programmed demonized negatives, failing to conceptualize the overwhelming positives a UBI would bring, and what it means for the future of not just our economy, but of the entire world. Some may think that we are only talking about the United States, but in case you haven't noticed, the US and its allies have been at work for some time, spreading their brand of democracy across the world, a wake-up call to those who believe themselves to be tried and true to the empire. However, it would be a mistake to identify being born in the US as a stake in future profits to be made. No, much like every other country in the world, the US is also a caste system, which means unless you are in the 1%, you are pretty much a nobody. But believe it or not though, we nobodies have the majority. And to turn the tables, we would just have to consolidate our monetary mobility behind a transcendental philosophy. Hopefully as a nobody, that is to the system. You don't think that you are at the bottom of society because you aren't smart enough or good-looking enough to become a 1%er. No, your place in this dystopia is because of the careful crafting of our keyholders and the ones who came before them, and their tool is nothing other than an ever-evolving system of social eugenics. Yes, it's the environment that makes a person who they are, or more precisely, referencing the formula of the self. Social conditioning is derived from environmental factors, economic factors, and genetic inheritance. We are the products of the keyholders of the narrative, who naturally, and more importantly, must for their own survival put their own brand of dystopian spin on every inevitable aspect of a turning or economic cycle, because it helps them maintain control. We generally see this in open display during the last phase transition of each scheduled economic crash, and boy are we teetering on the edge of oblivion this time. Because, for instance, if you can recall in that memory hole of yours that pre-2016, while we were being told that we were all the victims of fake news or misinformation about a certain border immigration crisis, that it has now factually turned into a not-so-full-on invasion here in 2023. Understand, though, that we're not in any way saying that those people do not have a right to survive. It's just a cause and effect topic that is highly impactful for the US economy. It is reported that there were roughly 2.2 million illegal border crossings into the US via Mexico in just 2022 alone. Why, though, was the narrative in 2016 driven to distract us from the massive upsurge in the already leaky southern border? To put it simply and bluntly, it is a perfect example of the fight over the management of immigrant welfare and the boon that it carries that translates to the polls, leaving out the intent of the polarized parties' ideologies. Then, in 2019, we were hit with a highly sensationalized and commercialized pandemic. But what it appeared to be more like was a worldwide crisis management experiment with a network of megalomaniacs driving the narrative. Since then, there has been a massive push to utilizing this newly formed rut we are currently in as an excuse for the keyholders to hit the global reset button in order to usher in the New World Order. And as surreal it is to hear such a thing be talked about so assuredly by so many various outlets, could you really sit there and think or say that you had not noticed this or any other flagrant fouls the keyholders have been committing for the last 23 years? But really though, if you investigate further, and I don't mean via major news agencies, it'd be a recognizable endeavor of the elite that has been ongoing for the last couple hundred years. When you do, though, let's all remind ourselves to keep our feet firmly planted in the primary. And for the detailed version of our definition of the primary, reference the HOBA in the preface of our book and in chapter 14, or you can hear about it in our audiobook posted here on YouTube. Keeping your feet in the primary, to put it rather plainly, is asking you to keep your perspectives tangible and real. The reason the New World Order is knocking on our door might have a lot to do about human nature, but let's leave out the dissonant ambience of demonic shape-shifting lizard people that have been slowly taking over the world and are awaiting the return of Nibiru. And that you, a light-working star child by day, demon slayer by night, has been reincarnated one last time to battle them in a cage match on pay-per-view, which is why you spend more time in your room blogging about it rather than dispatching them like Buffy did to the vampires. If that's your take, then there are plenty of Resonate platforms ready to continue to unlock the underworld. Thankfully, though, it is not the mission we, the members of the last religion, have been gifted with. Even if a topic has a chance at being TikTok trendy, we do not have that type of time to waste on affirmations that are firstly impossible to prove, and secondly nothing we can do anything about. We salute you on your quest to uncover the mud-flooded rabbit holes and endless sideshows of human ambience. Good luck tending to your gardens that require continual eccentric forms of embellishment, cope, and validation to sustain. Aside from crafting fanciful narratives that shore up a portion of the population's ability to survive via a choose-your-own-adventure backdrop, we, the members of the last religion, must be vigilant in recognizing distractive elements to our goal of apex equality. Do not cloud your judgment with the dissonant human ambience. Getting back to the tangible topic at hand, when you hear UBI, you might think it's solely an of the people and for the people concept, but you'd be only half right. Surprisingly, the key holders need a UBI just as much, if not more, than we do. Allow me to explain. Aside from the obvious reason that we know of, like a fair living wage to end the unnecessary suffering of the masses, the bigger reason is that the key holders have realized that in this hyper-reactive technological age we are living in, it has become nearly impossible to cast a spell of misdirection. Each side has gaslighted one another to the point where no one really understands the nature of reality. If it were not true, we wouldn't be here. The real news is that these keyholders, even though they predominantly broadcast on opposite ends of ideological spectrums, are really two sides of the same coin. And no matter how you embellish it, their overall goal is the same. They might start off with an altruistic mindset, but because of how the system is set up, their goal will always be the extraction of profit from every aspect of the theatrics of the dissonant human ambience. Let us now utilize for the first time a term that could be triggersome, but for good reason. I will be making references to people as NPCs, but never refer to anyone as a PC, because we are all relatively unaware of the objective reality of our surroundings. We see ourselves as the protagonist, and people just outside our periphery know us to be the antagonist. Amongst the key players of each side, the majority of the population are NPCs with social conditioning that equates to good intentions. But there are also the overpaid actors who help fuel the narrative in specific areas. Given the lengths we've seen these agendas being pushed, we cannot dismiss that there might even be some who are unable to escape their role on the agenda but know deep down that what they are doing is wrong. This all sounds highly conspiratorial, doesn't it? However, realizing that at the helm of these corporations in question, and the bigwigs at the boardroom table, let's recognize that each person undoubtedly believes they have the proper genetic inheritance. They have proven that they definitely have the right amount of economic mobility. And whether they realize it or not, they are there because they were born into the proper social conditions. This formula hath bestowed them the green light scepter to do exactly what they too were programmed to do. To make matters worse, many are complicit in their actions that lead to negative reactions. You rarely, if ever at all, hear of an apology from a keyholder of the narrative because it makes them look weak. Hopefully, post the knowledge of our carefully crafted formula of the self, which is social conditioning is derived from environmental and economic factors and genetic inheritance, we can fully comprehend that they do because they can, and if they relatively can, that in their minds, given the scarcity of their kind, the 1% that they are or have become one of the chosen. Realize, though, that we all do this relative to our own sphere of influence as well, which highlights a key understanding. For instance, when they are chosen, they take advantage of standard loopholes and perceived entitlement, such as insider trading. You see, they took action because they felt justified in breaking the law in the first place, right? Being a chosen one, in this respect, is not too much different on any level of society, and the key holders create this dystopian environment to mold every one of us into pawns for their games. We are an expendable resource, and they are the human resource department, which is why and how various demographics on both sides of the spectrum have come to label themselves as the perpetual victims. Underlying pro tip here is understanding that when you are a part of a group that has very similar algorithms, that you do not have to communicate directly with one another to be able to identify if one of your own has manifested an initiative that, if played out correctly, will continue to benefit their overall endeavor. I can think of no better time to say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. A direct correlation can be seen in sports when a player draws a foul. No one really had to tell them to do it because they know the rules of the game, therefore they know when to act, when to capitalize. The same can be said with any system of power and its actors. Some fail at it, some of them are horrible at the game, but relatively manage to get away with criminal acts because they have good lawyers. And some are so magically good at it that they hover just outside of the radar. And a few of them seem untouchable, yes? Some are parts of entire organizations that are sanctioned by the government to plan and enact the overthrow of foreign governments. And sometimes, depending who you're messing with, they can even have you unalived if you plan on testifying against them. So you see, on any scale, you don't have to be an official member of a team to be on the team. And so now you can see that any culture of society, no matter what form they take, can also function as a hive mind. Energy congeals, manifests, and then goes on to express. Furthermore, even when you see on the news that a player in whatever capacity is found guilty of an egregious moral or ethical action, we say, finally, someone is being held accountable. But realize that we are actually only casting a momentary spell of cope. Why? Well, that is because when the player who was not adept at covering their asses gets caught breaking the law, they are not only welcome misdirections to the source of the overall corruption, they are the scapegoat and are systematically devoured by their brethren on a public stage. Maybe you've seen people who claim to root out corruption thinking that it can be done away with if it is identified by enough people. But if this were true, we would not be here. You can follow the money all you want. You can study the declassified documents with redacted evidence. You can showcase leaked conversations, but they are not admissible in court and so on. But 99.9% of the time, nothing ever happens. And that is because the mechanisms that allow for the systems to be considered exploitable in the first place are never even brought to light. And just after that realization is when you hear that whisper on the wind of go back to sleep. The machine functions like a sports team, and like the fouls in sport, even when a team is at their lowest, are still haphazardly shambling towards the finish line, and so the rebound is just a matter of a team effort. If they lose a battle, then there is still the rest of that season's games, and of course there is always next year. Therefore, we can see that in regard to team toxic capitalism, since there is no market cap, they will never stop. Simultaneously, however, since we are all swimming around in the singularity of it all, even when the keyholders have their knees upon our necks, they too, much like the slaveholders of yesteryear, such as the renowned Marcus Aurelius, have on rare occasion had involuntary fits of compassion for the plight of the average plebeian. This causes the keyholders to recollect and regurgitate and their Ivy League leadership humanitarian class teachings. This bile they spit up while in a meeting with the lower staff members is a meld of Aurelian's Stoic perspectives of how it's natural for slaves to be slaves and how they should instead be chin up with their management of the cognitive dissonance of it all. While we're on the topic, what other old books could be considered HR manuals? Yes, the False Systems Human Resources Department has been shoveling this down our gullets since day one, and we love it, don't we? Of course we do, which is why their accounts of pseudo-philanthropy and heroism go on to become bestsellers, which is how they are able to excuse themselves when the time comes for them to break their own rules. They actually feel that they are acting in the best interest of the greater good. That's right, they truly in their heart of hearts believe they are fighting the good fight. And their team of yes-men throws them the constant validation to reassure it. Realize now that we all view ourselves as the protagonist in this epic tragedy. Moral and ethical relativism is a real thing after all. This is overtly evident when looking at our current society. Notice how the keyholders overcompensate and miss the mark on almost every decision they make. If you don't, then you are a tried and true plebeian of the ever-crumbling empire. But ultimately, the reason the keyholders cannot make the right decisions is because when inequality is at the helm, then power can only be pushed to an extreme. And even when it is not, you have those whose spectrum of understanding do not fundamentally match up, and they are naturally prone to don the red hat against the keyholders' hyper-progressive initiatives, and vice versa. And as we all know by now, the aspiring elite members know this and use it to their advantage. Why even a popular news agency published back in 2019 stated with statistics that 1 in 5 of our so-called leaders or CEOs are psychopaths. For our key holders of the narrative, they know the power they wield, and what better way to exercise that power by playing both sides of any conflict simultaneously. A key facet to their power is that they can provide a tool of false empowerment from their tool belt of self-righteousness for the downtrodden and simultaneously sanctify perpetual victimhood, which later helps them at the polls. Realize, however, that taking the scraps of the elite in this manner and trying to launch a media echo chamber can be actually very harmful towards the attainment of equality overall. It's how earthquakes create tsunamis and so on. It is a valid act, but it is in desperation, because it comes with the branding of an indentured servant. You see, no matter how justifiable your protest against any of the false system's disparities is, if you do not fix the core of the issue, you might as well be trying to fight ocean waves crashing onto a beach with a squeegee. Now, don't get all pointy and puffy when you hear this analogy, because the real injustice is not only the fact that your fellow citizens cannot seem to handle themselves publicly, but it is because of the mismanagement of those in power who are wholly unqualified to represent you, because of the bridle and bit and blinders upon their own faces. They are stuck playing their role in all this as well. They just don't know the difference between up and down once they've sunk so low. Think about it. Who creates the environment? And we are animals, are we not? America only wages authorized wars, and a war against the keyholders is never authorized. The only other type of animal versus animal violence we allow is the quadrupedal type. Do we fault wild animals from killing one another? Do we step in and stop them? No, that would disrupt the food web. Likewise, the apex predators would die off if we stopped them from being able to hunt their prey. This is why the keyholders of the narrative cannot resist setting us all up for failure, because their very lives and their portfolios depend on it. Therefore, no amount of Guy Fawkes masks responding to a toot on social media will be enough to turn the tides. We most assuredly will follow the formula of social conditioning based on our environmental and economic factors. And our genetic inheritance just adds those special nuances which brands each one of us with key indicators that help the key holders to define and divide us more effectively. In the meantime, we all try our very best to achieve the American dream. It's a game. We all have the programming to fight savagely for survival, but when it comes time for implementation and execution, the mission is carried out with baffling amounts of ineptitude, never looking to the underlying cause of the imbalance. We are programmed to think and speak as if true equality is a fable or a dream. This is because it has been erroneously labelled as communism, which even in itself isn't a bad thing, but it's never been advertised to have successfully been practiced, and is kryptonite to capitalism, so naturally is demonized by the establishment. You might have wondered at one point in your life as to why we can't just all get along and/or share our things like we were taught as children. Why was true equality never implemented at the base of society since the beginning? The short answer is covetous tribalism carried out through state-endorsed theft, murder, rape and slavery of those who lacked a transcendental philosophy that mistakenly ordained their culture as chosen by God, which is an obvious egotistical embellishment rather than realizing that all cultures are of God, and I do mean that in a literal sense. And this trend will continue to be until there is a mutation within the evolution of the false system that either allows or is not superficially identified as the means for true equality to take root. This means that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, one that we will amplify and expand into a new horizon for all. What many do not realize is that elements of communism, which in their current form is a virtue signal to true equality. There are actually thriving shades of true equality blended into our economic system. But as you look at those systems, you can see points of exploitation or ammunition for those who live outside of those systems. The ultimate crime now is the keyholders refusing to let go of an obsolete mode of rulership by not allowing for true equality to emerge naturally. If you thought the book 1984 and all the other sci-fi dystopian novels was a bad omen, just wait. You see what's happening in the world from 2019 to right now, and you think you are not as expendable, then you are truly asleep. The keyholders are not only at fault but perpetual default, and I know you all have your list of names. But we keep the keyholders' names out of our goddamn mouths. It is not that we fear these people, it is to avoid providing ammo to opportunists, and because we make better use of our energy at the source of the issues. In time, you will come to understand why this is, was, and always will be a tenet of the last religion. We were talking about socialism, which means that the means of production, distribution, and exchange are owned or regulated by the community as a whole. While the United States operates primarily under a pseudo-toxic, plutocratic capitalist system, it also incorporates elements of socialism in various public services and programs where it has to. You might disagree, so let's list them. Public libraries in the United States epitomize the socialist principle of communal sharing of resources for the benefit of all, as they are funded by the public through taxes and provide free access to information and resources. Similarly, public schools ensure that every child has access to education, regardless of their family's financial status, aligning with socialist ideals of equal opportunity. The infrastructure of roads and highways, mostly publicly funded and maintained for communal use, is a hallmark of socialist planning, where the government provides essential services for the benefit of all citizens. Municipal water and utilities demonstrate a form of collective ownership and management of key services, being publicly managed to distribute essential resources like water and electricity. Public parks and beaches, maintained using public funds for the enjoyment and benefit of the entire community, reflect the socialist ideal of shared public spaces and resources, offering free and open access to natural resources for leisure and relaxation. Likewise, police and fire services are essential, publicly funded services available to all citizens, reflecting the socialist ideal of collective responsibility for public safety and welfare. Social Security, a program that redistributes wealth in the form of pensions and benefits, attempts to ensure that elderly and disabled citizens have a safety net, aligning with socialist values of supporting the vulnerable in society. Medicaid and Medicare provide healthcare coverage to low-income individuals, the elderly, and people with disabilities, funded by taxpayers, providing essential health services regardless of an individual's ability to pay, embodying the socialist principle of communal responsibility for health and well-being. Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, offers financial assistance to individuals who are disabled and unable to work, based on the principle of using collective resources to support individuals who are physically unable to participate in the workforce, aligning with socialist principles of collective welfare. Government regulation of food and drug safety through entities like the FDA is another form of public welfare protection, a concept that aligns with socialist principles of the state playing a role in safeguarding the health of its citizens. The US Postal Service, as a government-run entity that tries to provide a uniform service across the nation, reflects the socialist principle of the government ensuring basic services are available to all. Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, provides nutritional assistance to low-income individuals and families, aiming to alleviate hunger and improve health by offering a means to purchase food. Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TNF, offers temporary financial assistance to low-income families with children, along with job training and other support services, representing a redistribution of resources to support vulnerable families and aligning with socialist values of supporting those in need to ensure a minimum standard of living. Housing assistance programs like Section 8 housing vouchers provide financial assistance to help low-income individuals and families afford housing, embodying the socialist concept of housing as a basic right. Unemployment insurance provides temporary financial assistance to workers who are unemployed through no fault of their own, funded through employer taxes, and is an example of collective provision for individuals facing economic hardship due to job loss, reflecting a communal approach to economic stability. Non-profit organizations often focus on areas like healthcare, education, environmental conservation, and social welfare, operating on the principle of serving the public good, which resonates with socialist ideals of prioritizing community welfare over individual profit. Many non-profits rely on donations, grants, and volunteer efforts, reflecting a communal approach where resources are pooled together for the greater good, aligning with socialist concepts of collective action and responsibility. When individuals or corporations donate to charities, they are voluntarily redistributing a portion of their wealth to help others, resembling the socialist principle of redistributing resources for societal equality and welfare. Community foundations are local entities that manage donations to address community-specific issues, operating as a form of localized socialism, where resources are pooled and allocated according to community needs, often decided through collective decision-making processes. Crowdfunding platforms like GoFundMe or Kickstarter allow individuals to solicit and receive financial support from a large number of people for medical expenses, creative projects, or social causes, reflecting a form of communal support and solidarity. Now, after that long list, you can see that communism is alive and well, comrade. And as you can see, it is also necessary. Why think of how awful life would be if any of those programs that you or your family member might have taken part in if removed from the list? While we can praise the existence of these programs, when it comes to the criticism of how these programs are managed, that is another story we will delve into shortly. Beyond listing them for you, is to show you that we don't live in black and white society. If you have not realized our next goal, well, let me just come right out and say it. There is room for others, which is why you see a church or some other iteration of one every 2 blocks and so on. Religions are philosophies, and they deal with money through donations and operate their own relative businesses and are typically file their taxes under a non-profit designations 501c. Now I know some of you might be ready to flip some shekel tables like the holy protagonist did, but don't forget to flip your own table on your way out. You, being a citizen, provide money to what interests you. Therefore, you believe whatever endeavor that money goes towards as a worthy cause. Now, aside from wholesale corruption, freely donating money to lift the spirit and the well-being of the world definitely qualifies as a worthy cause. And in this context, is necessary, given that is how the law dictates the flow of monetary mobility for such entities. This is a good thing provided there is transparency. Since we are now starting to hear that socialism is an inevitability, then it means that the key holders will force it to be quote-unquote sustainable, just like it has in this current false system. And so here is where we talk about the false system's largest illusions. We have all been hearing their latest slogan of own nothing and still be happy. However, it has come to light that this was never an agenda but a prediction. A 2016 article picked up by Forbes, written by a member of the Danish Parliament, to get conversations started about the pros and cons of current technological development. So there is no official statement recorded, just the implementation of the inference that became viral due to sensational meme urinalism. That's a new word I made up for this video, a meme of the whole meme phenomenon. Since reporting news is referred to as journalism, then a meme is a trickle of information, a manifestation of communal biases. Want to have a meme understanding of life, then stick to memes. Want to have a real understanding of life, then you have to dig in and learn things you often reject due to your social conditioning derived from environmental and economic factors and genetic inheritance. However, given that the key holders have a horrible track record, we cannot afford to really take any of their musings lightly. Now, rest assured, the key holders of the narrative will naturally always be trying to gain control of everything, but realize that given the long list stated before that, nowhere are we, the people, barred from carving out a piece for ourselves. The thing is that the general populace really do have more power. It's just that we've been wielding it like a fidget spinning toddler in a poop-filled diaper. Going back to my statement about how 1 out of 5 leaders are psychopaths, we should take note that those businesses are all driven by endless greed to fuel disparity. So, hear me out here. What if we became psychopaths for true equality? Not the NPC version, but the Last Religion version. Believe me, there is enough room for us to operate. And if we run things the way we think they should be, then also be aware that section of the pie can be as large as we are willing to make it. And yes, it would eventually stand the chance of taking back control of hopefully everything that we have lost thus far and much more. You might be scoffing and snickering and saying, listen to this guy, he wants to save the world. To which I reply, you're damn right I do. Now, for those who might question our intentions, you wouldn't be doubtful if you had read our book, The Last Religion. Really though, as much as we need people to move the proverbial mountains, we don't really need to spend time convincing any doubting Thomases. You're either on our frequency, or you're tuned into something else, which is okay. But at least you can't blame us for trying to save the world. So why waste your time trying to stop something you don't believe would work? Save your energy and manifest elsewhere. Doubt all you want, but once this train is rolling, we too will never stop. Notice how most of the time spent on these videos has been building up to this point. But before we talk about the modality of the Last Religion's great mission, we must continue to prove our case. That way, we can have any of your false system's doubts laid to rest. We've talked about the existence of socialistic programs which are a far cry from true equality, but at least someone is trying. Yes, that's a good sign for humanity overall, and it definitely boosts our chances of our endeavor. So, to get society as a whole to the next level, we would need to talk about the existing government waste. Ironically, pre-COVID era made this a bit of a task, but it wasn't too difficult. But post-COVID blew the lid off of all sorts of reservations about the key holders' intentions. For there is definitely someone behind the curtain not only pulling the strings, but also maintaining numerous grand-scale illusions. What string, you might say? There are many, but let's talk about the big one labelled federal debt. Firstly, understand that money is debt. The concept that money is debt emerges from the mechanisms of modern money creation and the banking system, especially within a fiat currency system where money isn't backed by a physical commodity like gold. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve in the United States, are pivotal in this process. They have the authority to create money, often through the issuance of government bonds or similar securities. These bonds, bought by various entities, including commercial banks using money they don't physically possess, which leads to the central bank crediting the bank's accounts, thereby creating new money. This action increases the money supply but simultaneously amplifies debt, as the bonds essentially function as IOUs from the government. Commercial banks also significantly contribute to money creation through fractional reserve banking. In this system, banks retain a portion of deposits as reserves and lend out the remainder. For instance, with a $1,000 deposit and a 10% reserve requirement, a bank would keep $100 and lend out $900. This $900, when deposited in another bank, forms the basis of a new loan, perpetuating the cycle. Hence, banks create money as debt, with each new loan representing both new money and new debt for the borrower. In modern economies, credit also acts akin to money. When a bank issues a loan, it typically credits the borrower's account, enabling payments with this credited amount. This credit, while representing money created from nothing, simultaneously constitutes a debt that the borrower must repay with interest. The process of government borrowing further illustrates this concept. And when governments issue securities like bonds that are bought by entities, including central banks, this introduces new money into the economy, but also increases government debt. And the situation is compounded by the interest charged on loans. Banks create the principal amount, but not the interest, leading to a scenario where there is always more debt in the system than available money to pay it off. This discrepancy necessitates the constant creation of new money and thus new debt, fueling an ongoing cycle in the financial system. Now, this current system contrasts sharply with historical money systems, where money was often directly representative of physical assets like gold or silver. In the current system, as briefly stated earlier, money's value is largely derived from the trust and creditworthiness of issuers, governments and banks, and its existence is inherently linked to debt. Hence the never-ending border crisis. They will come just like our ancestors did, and they will not hesitate to procreate because they are the future of America, while current Americans are getting pulled through the ringer. Sarcasm here. It's a business thing, so don't worry, it's nothing personal. If you don't like it, change the system. Oh wait, that's right, you can't, and ironically, that is why you are here. Stay honest with yourself. You aren't here for more cope. It's important to note that possibly thousands upon thousands of companies perpetually operate in the red with only hypothetical paths to profitability. Therefore, many are more or less in a long, drawn-out process of bankruptcy in order to change those hard assets into liquid ones so they can eventually cut ties. Most consumer products are designed to fail at some point, and whether you believe it or not, some companies do this as well. Enron being one of the big ones that most people know about. That being said, the key holders of the narrative want to pull an Enron on the US here again soon, because we will never meet the required projections to digging the US out of a hole of $33 trillion. But you can at least keep the system going, which is what the key holders are doing. Just downsizing and adjusting relatively is not in the formula of profit via capitalism. It's how you eventually go out of business. Think of all the echoes of boomers versus zoomers when talking about the cause and effect of this topic. See, because of the veil of the full system, for the most part, nobody can really ascertain the true reason as to why they suffer. So they're pointing at X and Y, but never considering the Z-axis, and when they do, there is plenty of buffers of virtue signaling from philanthropic contributions, and plenty of plausible deniability, and for the rest you have media inception and counter-campaigns. And if you get through all that, then there's a coven of lawyers. This isn't even the complete list, it's just a generalization. But why would we do this to ourselves, you might ask? Well, as it turns out, because of the full system, it is at this point the most efficient method of gaining control. Why should they have to play by the rules? Now, regarding that last statement, brings us to the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, following the Federal Reserve Act. This was and still is significant and controversial development in the history of the United States financial system. Take note how we will avoid talking about whose families are involved in its formation and those who now control it. Remember that in order for us to move forward as a whole, we need to stop the blame game and just work on creating a better system. There are plenty of outlets out there for fidget spinning if you wish to take part. When you realize how powerless you are to change the past, then we can move on together toward the future. The Fed is reported to have emerged as a response to a series of financial panics, most notably the Panic of 1907, which exposed the vulnerabilities of the nation's banking system. Both sides of the argument on any scenario of a crash will always point to triggers and the causes to those collapses, but realize that balance in a false system will never yield profit at a fast enough pace. It takes extreme imbalance to make people rich in the system of toxic capitalism. So even if there were elements of earnest to stabilizing the economic system and the creation of the Fed aimed to centralize control over monetary policy to prevent such crises, This move was met with skepticism and warnings from various historical figures who feared the concentration of financial power and the potential for misuse. And given its track record, has left us utterly jaded. Opponents such as Thomas Jefferson, although not alive during its establishment, expressed general skepticism about central banking in his time. He feared that such institutions could become too powerful and threaten the democratic process. Similarly, Andrew Jackson, another early critic of central banking, famously fought against the Second Bank of the United States, viewing it as a concentration of financial power that was prone to corruption and undue influence. Despite these warnings, the Federal Reserve structure was designed as a compromise, balancing central control with the autonomy of private banks. Another element of dissonant ambience is the fact that it's a blend of a public agency and a private organization. Another element of duality is the amount of supposed checks and balances in the form of divided powers. The Fed has a board of governors, appointed by the US President and confirmed by the Senate, and 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, owned by the member banks in their regions. This structure allows it to operate independently from direct political control, although it is not immune from political influence. The Federal Reserve does not receive funding from Congress, further enhancing its independence. It generates income through interests on government securities and its services to banks. Decision-making, particularly regarding monetary policy, is independent of the executive or legislative branches, designed to shield monetary policy from short-term political pressures. However, the Fed's profits do not enrich private entities. After covering its expenses, it returns its earnings to the US Treasury. Now, we're talking about how the Fed is supposed to function, and we are leaving out a ton of its dysfunction due to the length of the video. But stay tuned to a coming announcement of the launch of our TikTok channel titled The Dissonant Human Ambience. The channel will focus on utilizing the lexicon of the philosophy of TLR while looking at current events in order to showcase what action and reaction looks like from our perspective, serving as a compass for future navigation. Now, as we were saying, despite its independence, the Fed's primary goals serve public interests, maximizing employment, stabilizing prices, and moderating long-term interest rates. Yet, the Federal Reserve's formation also marked the beginning of a shift away from traditional understandings of money, particularly the transition from the gold standard to fiat currency. The gold standard, a system in which currency was directly linked to literal bars of gold, had long been the basis for most countries' monetary systems. Under this standard, the value of a currency was directly tied to a specific amount of gold, and governments needed a substantial gold reserve to back their currency. However, the constraints of the gold standard, particularly during economic crises, led to its gradual abandonment. The Federal Reserve played a critical role in this transition, as its ability to adjust monetary policy was initially limited under the gold standard. The shift to a fiat currency system, where currency's value is not based on physical commodities, but rather the government's decree, allowed for more flexibility in monetary policy. This transition was fully realized in the US in 1971, when President Richard Nixon officially ended the conversion of US dollars to gold at a fixed value, marking the end of what was called the Bretton Woods system. This move to a fiat currency system has been fundamental in shaping modern economic policy and the role of central banks like the Federal Reserve. It allowed for more control over the money supply and interest rates, tools that have become essential in managing national economies. There you see circumnavigation of standards due to the inconveniences of law. In a sense, it's just an old version of the birth of cryptocurrency, which they say is decentralized, but that is only because it is in its early stages. Heck, it's already happening, and we don't have to think twice about the magic show that could be put on by the government that wishes to control that system. This brings us back to the federal debt, but more specifically, the debt ceiling. The interplay between cryptocurrency control, national debt, and political maneuvering paints a complex picture. A corrupt government wielding control over a cryptocurrency could, and when I say could, I mean will eventually exploit this power for various improper purposes, such as inflating the currency supply, censoring transactions, or using it for illicit activities. This possibility becomes particularly concerning when considered alongside the dynamics of national debt in a fiat currency system, where the traditional notions of debt are complicated by the government's ability to print its own money. The debates we see on the keyholders' media outlets surrounding the debt ceiling in countries like the United States are a part of the magic show of political theatre. While they ostensibly address fiscal responsibility, these debates are more symbolic than substantive, especially considering the government's capacity to influence the economy through monetary policy. The concept of a debt ceiling, therefore, appears to the public as a genuine effort at fiscal management, but it often masks the more complex realities of financial manipulation. Adding to this complexity is the role of government bonds. To counteract national debt, governments issue bonds, essentially IOUs, to finance their spending. These bonds are purchased by a variety of entities, including foreign governments. For instance, China has been a significant buyer of US debt, owning a substantial portion of it. As of early 2023, China held over $1 trillion in US Treasury securities, making it one of the largest foreign holders of American debt. Now ask yourself if the US plans on paying off that portion of the debt to China, its now number 2 rival, when hell freezes over. No, instead, it will work towards expanding its military presence in the Asian areas of the Pacific, which, by the way, there are 4 new US bases being built in the Philippines as of February 2023. This all supposedly to protect the relative sovereignty of the Philippines, and so that the American allies can flex their muscles and put their thumb on Taiwan. Some of you might not have properly heard what I'm attempting to allude to, which is the national debt is a red herring. The national debt is just a number. Because we have been perpetually at default since 1917, because the debt ceiling has been raised, extended or revised nearly 100 times. That's literally almost once a year. Now, does that not spell out perpetual default? Does it not show that the keyholders are rewriting the rules as they go along? Now, let us reference from the Last Religion's book, page 323, for the final example of how misappropriation, which is why things never get done around here. We could talk forever about how much American taxpayer money is currently being spent in the 2 major overseas conflicts, but it's one of those too soon topics. Please note that if you were born in the late 90s and early 2000s, that this should be a blur for you. There is so much misappropriated monetary mobility throughout our nation's history, such as failed car companies or banks, who should have never been included in the bailout anyway. How do we know that? Well, many had grandiose parties after the government bailed them out and handed out ridiculous amounts of bonuses to the company's CEOs, which totaled $1.6 billion post the 2008 crash. As for banks, here is a juicy stat for you. Since 2001, 561 banks have failed. Question? Are they not just there to hold our money and provide loans to the public through safe practices? I guess not. No conspiracy whispers on the wind. The pretense of this fairy tale is unfolding before our eyes. In 2008, we could have lost at least one major car company and ended up just fine, considering their loss of $11.2 billion shows that there was a hyper-negative demand for the product. So the bailout was so they could continue to churn out cars even if there was zero demand. We also heard that many of the employees were complaining that if their industry was no longer there, then what kind of jobs would they be qualified for? This led to negotiations of a re-education program for the employees, which of course never happened. In 2009, Grandma Motors had 243,000 employees. We can assume that it would not be necessary for all of them to be re-skilled in order to be eligible for hire in another industry, for 2 reasons. One is that not all of them worked on the assembly line, and 2, of those 243,000, there would definitely be a large number of those who already had degrees and/or general types of experience that would have made them versatile enough to migrate away and make out all right financially, despite the economic downturn. However, as an exercise, let's suppose the key holders went ahead with the re-education initiative and spared no expense for themselves other than their standard salary. Let's say that the entire 243,000 went on to get four-year degrees, and as an extra challenge, we will do it at average costs of university's tuition, plus the increase for the cost of living for not 2009 but for 2020. The average cost of tuition for 2020 being $9,349 annually times 243,000 employees times 4 years of public university education equals $9,087,228,000. This would have left $2,112,000 left over from their bailout, which for this experiment we will divide and deliver to the employees as severance packages as a thank you for years of dedicated service. 2,112,000 divided by 334,000 equals 9,028. That 9K would give the employees an economic factor buffer which would keep them going while they were getting retrained for their next move. Just imagine how much they could have done with the 2008 average cost of a degree. Just how much has tuition increased since 2008? Answer? It's nearly 40% higher by 2020. What's the latest news? Grandma Motors once again filed for bankruptcy in 2022. No surprise there. And this is but one example. Invest in people, not in companies that already had a fair run. How many cars do we need sitting lifeless in car lots? Imagine being the tiny home builder that was too big to fail. Would we have a housing problem at that point? Furthermore, if they make those mobile or allow people to migrate freely between cities without the tether of a mortgage, they could have relocated easily for their next work destination. However, with the way the system works currently, those homes would sit empty and in disrepair due to weatherization before any common folk could afford it. We think we are progressing, but realize that we are just stuck in our own web of coping with the problems we are creating, where we think we are making modern solutions when we are really just trying to fix errors made by the key holders' previous modern solutions, which endlessly makes life more and more complex. Americans often get boiled when they hear about the billions of dollars in foreign aid given out annually. The key holders take from the pockets of our citizens and give to countries that are deemed enemies. It's not like we don't know that we are simply paying them off in order to stave off their hostility. More importantly, look at how we became their enemy in the first place. We create our own enemies, we create our own problems, and the cleanup is perpetual, kind of like the Superman, Batman insurance effect. You know, how they always end up creating villains who always end up destroying the city they are sworn to protect. Could you imagine if for once the power of the US was not projected worldwide, and we instead focused inward and addressed our local problems? I mean, it almost sounds cliché at this point, or even, dare I say, an extremist tactic. Good God, what have we done? We cannot even take care of ourselves without accidentally conditioning the other end of the political spectrum into thinking they are burning the nation down by wanting to help others. Simultaneously, they do make a good point. How can we end world hunger if we cannot even achieve that goal in our own town? Duality indeed. Imagine if those same companies that took bailouts instead offered to pay for continuing education for their own employees, instead of funneling their profits away from those who help them earn it. Ask yourself why companies flex their philanthropic muscles on social media once a year rather than increasing the wages for their employees, which gave them monetary mobility in the first place. For the billionaires never reading this, I dare you to take a chance on us. Go all in. You know it's the right move. Save yourself from yourselves. It's beyond embarrassing at this point. In 2008 to 2012, charities still received over $300 billion in donations. This is during a recession. In 2017, the record shows that $410 billion were handed out to charities in just the United States. Then, on several websites back in 2020 and 2021, they projected that it would cost $330 billion to end world hunger. Yet nothing ever happens. Like seriously, people, you can't tell me that we're not doing something fundamentally wrong if we cannot solve our basic problems. We can fly rockets out of orbit, but we cannot afford to feed our children healthy food in the school cafeteria. Imagine if those same companies offered to help the employees in times of extreme need with these same funds. Of course, there would be a criterion in order to be eligible, as well as a system to assure that there are no attempts to defraud the fund, like, the opposite of what happened with the National COVID Emergency Fund, which was reported to have had an estimated $100 billion of it stolen from criminals. Wonder how much was allotted to those who didn't steal it, but probably didn't need it. Aside from this, better wages without moving the sliding bar of success in any situation, giving the money to the people equally, would always be the best case scenario. But that will never happen in a false system. Without true equality, there is always room for endless dissonant human ambience, isn't there? Another example. One thing that both American political parties want, such as the left wants, is expansion of social benefits programs, and the right wants to curtail foreign spending. The left wants to help the underprivileged, and right wants to help quote-unquote Americans. Looks like those two goals can be aligned if equality was at the base, right? Yet the innate tribalism that the false system conditions us into, mixed with non-aligning social conditioning, environmental factors, economic factors and genetic inheritance, causes each culture to instead focus on status division. And then there is further dividing of each culture's ideological goals. Thus, they end up both thinking that by standing in opposition from one another, that they are fighting the good fight. They are unable to focus on the problem, combined with the misappropriation from opportunists, which is why nothing ever gets done. That is until now. If you are still here, good God, you deserve a freaking Medal of Valor, as only 10% of the viewers managed to stay focused for this long. As sad as it sounds, this is how deep the false system has its claws in people's minds. It is ironic to know that the warnings given in the past, that is pre-2000s about attention span and the overall dumbing down of society, was true. However, we have only begun our launch, and we also have not hit that sweet spot in the algorithm. That is why we need you to subscribe, like, share, and ring that bell tower, my friends. This video also serves as a grand announcement for The Last Religion. We will be filing as a 501c non-profit organization in the near future, which, as stated before, will be considered a church filing. There are 10,000 religions in human history, and our time has undoubtedly come. In the coming months, videos will be made that will showcase examples of how our religion will come to manifest itself in the public view. But in the meantime, we need continued support as we move forward. Our team is growing, and when it expands, announcements will be made. Also, before we go, we'd like to hear from you in the comments as to whether you wish for us to provide merchandise such as shirts, which could have some artwork from any one of our videos. We have a couple designs in mind, but we have our ears open to your requests. This is part 1 of this particular series we will loosely call Why Us and Why Now. Now, please proceed to part 2, and thank you for your support.